My husband signed the divorce papers without knowing I was the secret daughter of a trillionaire. But what he did not know was that my family controlled the investment his company needed to survive. My husband signed the divorce papers without knowing I was the secret daughter of a trillionaire. But what he did not know was that my family controlled the investment his company needed to survive. Callum Mercer placed his signature on the final page with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he had just removed the last obstacle between himself and a larger life. The fountain pen made a soft scratching sound across the cream paper, then stopped. At that exact moment, his phone lit beside the legal folder. Ellington Global Holdings had approved the final review for a $12 billion investment in Mercer Aerodyne. Callum glanced at the message, and satisfaction settled across his face. For 3 years, he had tried to reach the private family behind Ellington Global. Their capital could complete his electric aircraft program, protect his company from mounting debt, and carry his name into markets he had only spoken about in interviews. He looked across the polished conference table at Zora and smiled with almost courteous relief. To him, the timing felt perfect. The marriage was ending just as his real future began. Zora sat opposite him in a deep burgundy dress, her hands resting calmly beside the unsigned copy of the agreement. Morning light moved across her rich brown skin and caught the old silver brooch pinned near her shoulder. Callum had seen that brooch hundreds of times and never once asked where it came from. He had never noticed the small crest engraved into its center, the same crest now glowing on his phone beneath the Ellington Global message. Sabine Cross, Zora's attorney, stood near the window with a closed leather portfolio. She knew what Callum did not. She knew the private trust he had dismissed as insignificant was part of one of the largest family-controlled fortunes in the world. She knew Zora had spent 6 months reviewing Mercer Aerodyne's finances on behalf of her father. Most of all, she knew the man celebrating across the table had just signed away the only personal connection he would ever have had to the woman deciding whether his company deserved to be saved. Callum slid the papers toward Zora. "This is better for both of us," he said. His voice held no cruelty on the surface, only the cold reason of a chief executive explaining an unfavorable merger. "You have always wanted a quieter life. I need someone who understands the world I am entering." Zora lowered her eyes to the signature. There it was, bold and final, beneath terms his attorneys had prepared to look generous. He offered her a modest apartment, several personal accounts, and enough money to maintain the simple life he believed was all she had ever known. She had not requested stock in his company. She had not asked for the penthouse, the vacation property, or a public settlement. Callum had mistaken restraint for ignorance. Zora picked up the pen. For one brief moment, she remembered the man he had been before applause taught him to measure love by usefulness. Then she signed her name in a steady hand. Zora Ellington. Callum barely looked at it. His phone chimed again with another message from the family office. Final authority will attend the review in person. He smiled and closed the folder. Across from him, Zora placed the pen down with quiet precision. He thought the most powerful people in America had finally agreed to open a door for him. He had no idea the woman he had just divorced was the one holding the key. Callum leaned back in his chair as though the signature had settled more than a marriage. To him, it had cleared the path ahead. He checked the message from Ellington Global again, then placed his phone face up on the table so the name remained visible. "You should be pleased," he said. "The agreement is more than fair." Zora looked at the pages between them. The settlement gave her a quiet apartment on the north side of the city, a modest financial account, and several pieces of artwork he had always considered hers because he did not value them. He retained the penthouse, the vacation home in Aspen, his company shares, and every visible symbol of the life they had built. Callum believed generosity meant leaving her enough to disappear comfortably. "You have always said you never cared about money," he continued. "This lets you go back to the kind of life you prefer." Zora lifted her gaze. "And what kind of life is that?" The question was calm, but Callum heard challenge where there was only clarity. He folded his hands. "Quiet. Private. Away from the pressure." Sabine remained near the window, her expression controlled. She had heard men describe women as simple when they meant unthreatening, private when they meant invisible, and content when they meant useful without recognition. Callum glanced at the clock. Blythe Carraway was waiting downstairs, and he had promised they would arrive together at the Mercer Aerodyne Gala before 6. The event would celebrate the company's expansion plans and, unofficially, introduce Blythe as the woman standing beside him in the next chapter of his public life. "We became incompatible," he said. "There is no shame in that." Zora touched the edge of the legal folder. "No shame for whom?" His jaw tightened slightly. "This is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes emotional with you." The insult was delivered softly, polished by years of executive restraint. He had learned to make dismissal sound reasonable. Zora remembered when that voice had once comforted her. Before the tailored suits, before the interviews, before every dinner became a networking opportunity, Callum had asked for her judgment. He admired the way she saw beneath appearances. Now he resented that same gift because it exposed how much of his confidence depended on being admired. "You were never built for the world I am entering," he said at last. The sentence rested in the room with the finality of another signature. Sabine looked toward Zora, but Zora did not react. She had expected anger, perhaps even cruelty. What surprised her was how little the words wounded once they confirmed what she already knew. Callum did not believe she belonged in his future because he had never understood where her life began. He thought her silence came from having nothing to say. He thought her lack of display meant a lack of power. Most of all, he thought the world ahead of him was larger than anything she had known. Zora closed the folder and rose. The movement was unhurried, graceful, and complete. Callum watched her with the faint impatience of a man waiting for an emotional scene that never arrived. "That is all?" he asked. "You are not going to argue?" Zora adjusted the cuff of her black coat. "Would it change your decision?" "No. Then there is nothing to argue about." She turned toward Sabine. The attorney picked up the leather portfolio and opened the conference room door. From the hallway came the quiet sound of an elevator arriving. Callum's phone chimed again. The message read, "Ellington Security Detail has arrived." Zora paused at the threshold. "Enjoy your evening, Callum." He gave a brief nod, already looking back at his phone. He did not notice the old silver crest on her brooch catching the light as she walked away, identical to the one displayed beside the message announcing the arrival of the family he had spent years trying to impress. The elevator carried Zora and Sabine down 32 floors in near silence. The mirrored walls reflected a woman Callum had spent years underestimating, composed, elegant, and entirely beyond the future he had planned for her. Sabine glanced at the silver crest on Zora's brooch. "He still did not recognize it," she said. Zora looked toward the descending numbers above the door. "He never asked." The answer held no bitterness, only fact. Callum had noticed the cut of her dresses when investors were present, the cost of a handbag when it seemed too modest for a gala, and the guest list she could not improve for him. He had never asked why the same discreet emblem appeared on her mother's letters, the antique stationery in her desk, or the private foundation documents she reviewed late at night. He saw details only when they served his ambition. The elevator opened into the marble lobby. Beyond the glass entrance, 3 black sedans waited beneath the covered drive in exact formation. None carried ordinary license plates. Each displayed a small silver insignia near the rear door. The building manager stood straighter when he saw them. 2 security officers stepped forward, not with urgency, but with the seamless coordination of people trained to make powerful arrivals look quiet. Zora slowed for half a second. She had spent most of her adult life avoiding scenes like this. Her father's world came with private terminals, sealed meetings, and rooms where heads of corporations waited for permission to speak. She had chosen a smaller name, a quieter apartment, and a marriage she hoped would be built without the distortion of inheritance. Now the life she had protected from Callum stood outside waiting to receive her. A tall driver opened the center car's rear door. "Ms. Ellington," he said. "Mr. Ellington is at the family office." The name carried through the lobby. Sabine watched Zora's face, but there was no triumph there, only weariness and resolve. Behind them, the elevator doors opened again. Callum emerged with his phone in one hand, still reading a message from Ellington Global. He stopped when he saw the convoy. At first, his expression showed irritation, as though the vehicles had blocked his own car. Then he noticed the crest. His gaze moved from the sedans to Zora's brooch, and something uncertain entered his eyes. "Zora," he called. She turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him. Callum approached, lowering his voice when he realized several people in the lobby were watching. "What is this?" "Transportation," she said. The simplicity of the answer unsettled him. "Why are they calling you Ellington?" Sabine's expression remained neutral. Zora looked at the man who had shared her home for 11 years and never once asked about the name she carried before marriage. "Because that is my name." Callum's phone chimed again. The message on the screen confirmed that the Ellington family representative had arrived in the city ahead of the investment review. He glanced toward the sedans, then back at Zora. "You know them?" The question came too late and revealed too much. Zora had once imagined telling him the truth over dinner, explaining why she chose privacy and why her father kept his holdings away from public attention. But every year, Callum became more impressed by access and less interested in people who offered none. The secret had stopped being a test. It had become an answer. "My father is waiting," she said. Callum's face changed. Not fully, not yet, but enough for Zora to see the first crack in his certainty. "Your father?" Before she could respond, the driver stepped aside and revealed a leather folder resting on the rear seat. Embossed across the cover were the words Ellington Global Holdings, Final Investment Authority. Callum read them. His hand lowered slowly to his side. Zora entered the car without another word. As the door closed, he remained in the lobby, staring at the crest he had spent 3 years trying to reach, finally realizing it had been sitting across from him at breakfast every morning. The center sedan moved away from the curb with the other 2 vehicles following at an exact distance. Through the tinted window, Zora watched the building recede behind them. Callum remained visible beneath the covered entrance, one hand still holding the phone that had announced his greatest opportunity. From a distance, he looked smaller than he ever had in a boardroom. Sabine sat across from Zora and opened the leather folder marked Final Investment Authority. "Your father approved the review committee this morning," she said. "He also left the final decision to you." Zora looked down at the documents. Mercer Aerodyne's expansion plan filled the first section: electric aircraft prototypes, international manufacturing agreements, research partnerships, and $12 billion in requested capital. The numbers were impressive from a distance. Up close, they carried the marks of Callum's ambition. Costs had been pushed into later years. Delivery schedules assumed every test would succeed on time. Debt projections depended on contracts that had not yet been signed. He had built a future that required nothing to go wrong. Zora had spent 6 months studying the company in silence. She knew where the technology was strong, where the leadership was weak, and how many employees depended on decisions made in rooms they would never enter. Callum believed Ellington Global had noticed Mercer Aerodyne because of his presentations. In truth, Gideon had asked Zora to examine the company after she mentioned its electric propulsion work during a family foundation meeting. She had never asked her father to invest. She had only said the technology deserved a closer look. Her judgment had opened the door Callum spent years trying to force. The sedan turned onto a private avenue lined with winter trees and understated stone buildings. At the far end stood the Ellington family office, a 12-story structure without a public sign. Power did not need to display its name there. "Blythe will be waiting for him downstairs," Sabine said. "They have the gala tonight." Zora closed the folder halfway. She could picture Blythe in a silver gown, standing beside Callum beneath the Mercer Aerodyne logo while cameras recorded the beginning of his new life. Once, the image might have broken something inside her. Now it only clarified how carefully Callum had planned to replace substance with presentation. He had scheduled the divorce before the gala because he wanted the old chapter closed before the cameras arrived. He had never considered that Zora might leave the room with a future larger than his own. Her phone vibrated inside her bag. The screen showed 3 messages from Callum. The first asked whether Ellington was her mother's family name. The second demanded to know why she had never told him. The third was shorter: "We need to speak before the review." Zora read them without answering. For 11 years, Callum had possessed every opportunity to know her. He had met her father once at a museum fundraiser, but Gideon had been introduced simply as a donor, and Callum spent the evening pursuing a venture capitalist across the room. He had seen private letters arrive with the Ellington seal and assumed they came from a charity board. He had watched Zora advise foundation directors on projects worth hundreds of millions and dismissed the work as volunteer service. The truth had never been hidden behind a locked door. He had simply never considered her important enough to ask the right questions. The sedan entered the underground garage of the family office. Gideon Ellington waited near the private elevator in a dark overcoat, his silver hair neatly cut, his posture straight despite his 68 years. When Zora stepped from the car, he did not ask whether she was all right. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that sympathy offered too quickly could feel like doubt. He opened his arms, and she entered the embrace she had postponed for too long. "Welcome home," he said quietly. Zora closed her eyes for one brief moment. Then she stepped back, lifted the investment folder, and said, "We have work to do." The private elevator opened directly into the executive floor of Ellington Global Holdings, where silence carried more authority than noise. Zora walked beside Gideon through a corridor lined with black and white photographs of ports, rail systems, research laboratories, and hospitals built across 5 continents. The empire had never depended on a single industry. It owned logistics networks, energy infrastructure, technology funds, medical systems, and private credit platforms large enough to move markets without appearing in headlines. Callum had spent years imagining Ellington Global as a distant gatekeeper. Zora had grown up learning the names of the people who kept it running. Inside the main conference room, a review team waited around an oval table of dark walnut. No one looked surprised to see her. They rose when Gideon entered, but he motioned toward Zora before taking a seat along the side. "My daughter will lead," he said. The words were simple, yet they settled something inside her. Gideon had never confused protection with control. He had allowed her to build a life away from the family name, even when he feared the world would misunderstand her quietness. Now he offered authority without demanding that she become someone louder. Zora placed the Mercer Aerodyne folder at the head of the table and opened it to the financing summary. "The technology is credible," she began. "The capital structure is not." The room listened. She outlined the company's strengths first: a promising electric propulsion system, experienced engineers, valuable research partnerships, and a manufacturing team capable of meeting federal certification standards. Then she turned to the weaknesses. Callum had hidden beneath optimistic projections. The company had borrowed against future contracts that remained unsigned. Prototype delays were treated as temporary even though supplier reports showed deeper problems. Executive bonuses had increased while research reserves declined. Most concerning, Mercer Aerodyne's public timeline assumed regulatory approval 18 months earlier than independent estimates considered realistic. Gideon watched without interruption. He had seen Zora advise foundation boards and evaluate complex investments before, but today her judgment carried a different weight. She was not reviewing a stranger's company. She was separating personal pain from financial truth in real time. One committee member asked whether the divorce created a conflict. Zora met the question directly. "It creates knowledge," she said, "not permission to act unfairly." She recommended that the review continue, but only with independent technical verification, revised debt limits, and complete disclosure from management. The investment would not be approved because Callum was her former husband, and it would not be denied for the same reason. Gideon's expression softened with quiet pride. At the end of the meeting, he closed his copy of the report. "Your recommendation?" Zora looked at the final authorization page. She could have ended Callum's expansion with one sentence. No one in the room would have questioned her. Instead, she said, "Bring them in for the final review. Let the company prove what is real." Gideon nodded. "And Callum?" "He answers the same questions as everyone else." Her phone vibrated again. This time, Callum's message was no longer demanding. "Zora, please tell me who you are." She read it once, then placed the phone face down beside the investment file. All through their marriage, he had asked what she could contribute to his world. He had never asked who she had been before entering it. 2 days from now, he would walk into this room expecting to negotiate with Gideon Ellington. Zora turned to the review team and requested the final risk schedules. Callum still believed her secret was wealth. He had not yet understood that the greater revelation would be discovering how much power she could hold without allowing it to change her. Long before Callum Mercer learned to measure people by the rooms they could enter, Zora had already spent most of her life stepping away from doors that opened too easily. She was born in a private hospital wing overlooking Manhattan, where security officers checked every visitor and newspapers were told only that Gideon Ellington's family had welcomed a daughter. Her mother, Evelyn Rowe, had been a respected historian who valued ordinary routines more than public attention. She taught Zora to make her own bed, write thank you notes by hand, and listen carefully when people believed no powerful person was in the room. Gideon taught her a different lesson. Wealth could protect a family, but it could also distort every introduction, every friendship, and every declaration of love. By the time Zora was 16, she understood that some classmates invited her places because of her last name, while others avoided her because they assumed she could never understand an ordinary life. She learned to recognize the pause that followed the word Ellington, the moment when curiosity became calculation. After Evelyn died, Zora began using her mother's surname in school and professional settings. Gideon did not object. He arranged protection quietly and allowed her to study public policy without reporters following her across campus. She lived in a modest apartment near Georgetown University, took the subway when possible, and built friendships with people who knew nothing about the family office. For the first time, conversations did not begin with questions about private jets, inheritance, or whether her father planned to buy another company. They began with books, late assignments, bad coffee, and the kind of small worries money could not solve for anyone. Zora did not reject her family. She served on foundation committees, reviewed development projects, and spent summers learning how Ellington Global evaluated risk. Gideon insisted that inheritance without competence was only a delayed failure. She studied balance sheets, labor agreements, engineering proposals, and the quiet consequences hidden behind ambitious announcements. When she disagreed with senior executives, she was expected to explain why. No one excused weak thinking because she was his daughter. Still, she kept that world separate from the life she hoped to choose for herself. She wanted to know what it felt like to be loved without a financial statement standing behind her. She wanted a man to notice how she thought before discovering what she could inherit. When she met Callum at an aviation policy conference in Atlanta, he was not yet a chief executive. He was a driven vice president carrying a worn leather case and presenting a clean energy proposal to a nearly empty afternoon session. His ideas were imperfect, but his belief in them was sincere. Afterward, he found Zora near the coffee table and asked what she thought. She gave him an honest answer, pointing out that his financing plan assumed government support that had not been secured. Instead of becoming defensive, he listened. They spoke for nearly an hour. Callum never asked whether her family knew anyone important. He asked what she had studied, what she believed, and why she thought aircraft companies misunderstood public trust. That evening, Zora returned to her hotel room and called Gideon. "I met someone who listened," she said. Her father was quiet for a moment. "Then let him keep listening before you tell him whose daughter you are." Zora believed there would be time. She believed love, once proven, would make the truth easier to share. What she did not understand was that applause would eventually change the questions Callum asked. Years later, he stopped wondering who she was and began wondering what she could do for the image he wanted. By then, Zora no longer needed to reveal her inheritance to test his love. His indifference had already delivered the result. In the beginning, Callum had been the kind of man who stayed after the conference ended to stack abandoned chairs. His title was Vice President of Strategic Development at a small aviation firm, but the title sounded grander than the office he occupied or the authority he held. He worked from a narrow room near the back of a converted warehouse outside Atlanta, where prototype diagrams covered the walls and the heating system failed whenever winter arrived. Zora visited for the first time 3 weeks after they met. Callum showed her a model of a short-range electric aircraft he believed could change regional travel. His excitement filled the room, but the financial plan beneath it was fragile. He expected government grants that had not been approved, supplier discounts that had not been negotiated, and a production schedule that allowed no margin for delay. Zora listened until he finished. Then she asked 3 questions that made him sit down and reopen every page. He did not resent her for seeing the weaknesses. He thanked her. That was what she loved first. For several months, they met in quiet restaurants and airport coffee shops between his business trips. Callum spoke about clean aviation, public trust, and the possibility of building something that mattered beyond profit. Zora spoke about transportation policy and the way large systems often failed ordinary people while executives celebrated scale. He admired her restraint. He told her she was the only person he knew who could enter a room full of louder voices and change the direction of the conversation without raising her own. When he prepared his first presentation for the board, Zora helped him rebuild the argument. She removed inflated assumptions, reorganized the funding sequence, and added a public infrastructure partnership that made the project appear practical rather than idealistic. Callum presented the revised strategy as his own, but afterward he took her hands in the parking lot and said, "You saw the path before I did." At the time, private gratitude still felt intimate rather than incomplete. The board approved a pilot program. Callum was promoted. He asked Zora to marry him 6 months later in the same small restaurant where they had shared their first dinner. There were no photographers, no elaborate speech, and no powerful guests. He held a modest ring between trembling fingers and told her that she made him more honest. Zora almost told him everything that night. She nearly explained the Ellington name, the private holdings, the family office, and the fortune waiting behind the life she had chosen. Then Callum looked at her with such unguarded affection that she postponed the truth. She wanted one more season in which his love remained untouched by calculation. Their first years of marriage were simple. They rented a 2-bedroom house near the company's test facility and cooked late dinners after long workdays. When Callum doubted himself, Zora reminded him why the technology mattered. When engineers challenged his timeline, she helped him listen without confusing caution with disloyalty. She refused every suggestion from Gideon that Ellington Global quietly support the company. If Callum succeeds, she told her father, it must be because the work deserves it. Gideon respected the choice, though he warned that protecting a man from the influence of wealth did not guarantee wealth would never influence him. The company grew. Investors arrived. Callum's interviews became more frequent, his suits more expensive, and his calendar more carefully guarded. Still, for a while, he returned home and asked Zora what she thought. Then one evening, after a televised business segment praised him as the visionary behind electric flight, he entered the kitchen carrying a bottle of champagne and did not ask her anything at all. He spoke for 20 minutes about the applause, the invitations, and the people who finally knew his name. Zora listened from across the counter. The man she married was still there, but the room had begun filling with someone else. The change did not arrive as betrayal at first. It arrived as correction. Callum began asking Zora to wear brighter colors at investor dinners because cameras preferred contrast. He suggested she speak less about public accountability because some board members found the subject uncomfortable. When she declined a gala in New York to review a foundation report, he told her the role of a chief executive's wife came with responsibilities. Zora reminded him that she had her own work. He smiled as if she had made a charming joke. "Your foundation projects can wait," he said. "This is the future of the company." The sentence revealed more than he intended. In Callum's mind, her work remained optional because it did not carry his name. As Mercer Aerodyne expanded, their home changed with it. The rented house near the test facility became a penthouse of glass and pale stone. Family dinners became catered receptions. Callum stopped asking whether she liked the guest list and started asking whether she could be more useful in the room. He wanted names, introductions, and access. Zora gave him none from Ellington Global. She still believed success should rest on the strength of the technology, not on the weight of her father's fortune. Callum interpreted her refusal as limitation. "You know everyone through charity," he said one night while adjusting his cufflinks before a gala. "But none of those relationships ever lead anywhere." Zora stood behind him in the mirror, fastening the silver brooch at her shoulder. "Not every relationship is a transaction." Callum gave a distracted sigh. That is easy to say when you are not responsible for thousands of jobs. The irony settled between them, invisible to him. Zora had spent years advising decisions that affected far more people than Mercer Aerodyne employed. She had simply done it without cameras. Blythe Caraway joined the company during its most aggressive expansion. She understood Callum immediately. She praised his instincts in public, transformed his speeches into headlines, and made every appearance feel larger than the event itself. Where Zora asked questions, Blythe offered certainty. Where Zora warned about risk, Blythe called the same risk bold leadership. Callum began inviting her to private strategy dinners, then to weekend retreats, then to events Zora once attended beside him. He explained each change as business. "Blythe understands the demands," he said. "She knows how this world works." Zora recognized the phrase. It was another way of saying Blythe reflected the man Callum wanted people to see. The marriage did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It thinned through absences, unfinished conversations, and invitations addressed to Mr. Callum Mercer and guest. Zora stopped asking when he would be home. Callum stopped noticing that she no longer waited. The final wound came at a foundation banquet where Gideon attended quietly under another board member's invitation. Callum met him near the entrance and spoke for less than a minute before excusing himself to greet a senator. Later, Gideon asked whether Callum knew who he was. Zora looked across the ballroom at her husband laughing beside Blythe. "He knows you support the museum," she said. Gideon studied her face. "And nothing more?" He never asked. A month later, Callum presented the divorce papers. He described the decision as inevitable, respectful, and necessary for the future. Zora listened while he explained that Blythe was better suited to the life ahead. He did not admit to an affair, and Zora did not need the admission. The betrayal was not only that another woman had entered the marriage. It was that Callum had spent years turning Zora's quiet strength into evidence that she had nothing to offer. When he finished speaking, she asked one question. "Have you already chosen the date?" Callum looked briefly surprised. "For what?" "For the life you plan to announce after me." His silence answered. Zora nodded, opened the settlement draft, and began to read. He believed she was accepting defeat. In truth, she was making certain his decision remained entirely his own. The Mercer Aerodyne file reached Zora through a secure family channel 6 months before the divorce was finalized. At first, it appeared to be another investment request among dozens crossing Ellington Global's review desk each quarter. The proposal described an electric aircraft program with national potential, a manufacturing expansion across 3 states, and a $12 billion capital requirement. Callum's photograph appeared on the opening page beneath the words "Visionary Leadership." Zora read the document alone in her home office while evening light faded across the city. She recognized his language in every paragraph. Bold growth. Historic opportunity. Unmatched momentum. Beneath the confidence, however, the numbers told a less polished story. Mercer Aerodyne needed the investment not only to complete the new aircraft, but also to cover debt created by rapid expansion. Suppliers had raised prices. Certification testing had fallen behind schedule. Several contracts presented as expected revenue were still under negotiation. The company possessed strong technology, but Callum had built the financial plan as though ambition could prevent delay. Gideon asked Zora to lead the confidential review because she understood aviation policy, corporate governance, and the man behind the projections. "You may decline," he told her during a private call. "No one will question the conflict." Zora looked at Callum's signature on the proposal. "If the company is worth saving, the employees should not lose their future because of our marriage." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "And if the company is not worth saving, then the truth should decide that, not my pain." For the next 6 months, Zora examined Mercer Aerodyne without revealing her role. She reviewed engineering reports after Callum fell asleep beside her. She compared board presentations with supplier schedules while he attended dinners with Blythe. She listened as he complained that Ellington Global moved too slowly, never realizing the woman across the breakfast table was the reason the review remained open. Several times, Zora considered telling him. Each moment offered a chance. One evening, Callum returned from a financing meeting discouraged and admitted that the company might not survive without Ellington's support. Zora asked what he would change if the investment arrived. He answered that he would expand faster, enter Europe, and prove every critic wrong. He did not mention protecting research staff, revising the debt plan, or correcting the timeline. Another evening, she asked whether he believed caution could be a form of leadership. Callum laughed and said cautious people rarely built anything important. Zora closed the report on her lap and understood that he no longer remembered who had once challenged his earliest assumptions. The final review showed that Mercer Aerodyne could survive, but only if leadership accepted limits. Zora recommended independent financial oversight, slower expansion, stronger employee protections, and direct reporting to the investment committee. Gideon approved her conditions and placed final authority in her hands. She did not tell Callum, not because she wanted to trap him, but because their marriage had reached a question only his behavior could answer. Would he value her when he believed she had no access, no fortune, and no power to advance his future? The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. Callum explained that Zora no longer belonged in the world he was entering. She listened, already knowing that world was waiting for her decision. On the morning they signed, Ellington Global sent confirmation that the final review would proceed. Callum smiled at the message while Zora closed her pen. He believed the investment represented freedom from a wife who could not help him. In reality, his company was already resting in the hands of the woman he had chosen to leave. 2 days later, Callum arrived at Ellington Global headquarters expecting to negotiate with Gideon Ellington. He wore a dark navy suit, a silver tie, and the expression of a man prepared to turn uncertainty into agreement. Blythe walked beside him carrying a presentation tablet and a folder embossed with the Mercer Aerodyne logo. 3 board members followed, speaking quietly about valuation, production schedules, and how much authority Ellington Global might demand in exchange for $12 billion. None of them knew Zora had reviewed every page before they entered the building. The private elevator opened onto the executive floor without a receptionist, public sign, or display of wealth. The silence made Callum lower his voice. A senior aide led the group into a conference room surrounded by glass and winter light. Gideon sat halfway down the long walnut table, not at its head. Callum noticed the empty chair at the center and assumed it belonged to the family chairman. He greeted Gideon with careful warmth and thanked him for the opportunity. Gideon accepted the words with a brief nod. "The final authority will join us shortly," he said. Callum arranged his materials and glanced toward the closed door. Blythe leaned near him. "This is good," she whispered. "If the decision-maker is coming in person, they are serious." Callum allowed himself a small smile. He had spent the previous 48 hours trying to reach Zora, but every call went unanswered. He had searched the Ellington family records and found almost nothing useful. Gideon's daughter had been kept away from public profiles for decades. One old charity photograph showed a young black woman beside him, but the image was grainy and the name beneath it read Zora Ellington Rowe. Callum told himself the resemblance was coincidence. It had to be. The conference room door opened. Every person at the table stood except Gideon. Zora entered wearing a black tailored suit, the silver family brooch fastened at her shoulder. Her long hair was swept away from her face, and a slim investment file rested in her hand. She did not look toward Callum first. She walked to the empty chair and placed the folder before her. Gideon rose then, not to take the seat, but to introduce her. "Gentlemen, Miss Carraway, my daughter will lead today's review." The room became still. Blythe's prepared smile disappeared. One board member looked from Zora to Callum, waiting for an explanation he could not provide. Callum remained standing several seconds longer than everyone else. "Your daughter," he said. The words sounded almost private despite the size of the room. Zora met his eyes with the same calm expression she had worn while signing the divorce papers. "Good morning, Callum." Gideon resumed his seat along the side, leaving the head of the table to her. Callum slowly sat down. He looked at the Ellington crest on her brooch, then at the identical emblem embossed on the folder in front of her. Every overlooked detail returned at once. The private letters, the unlisted family accounts, the convoy, the father he had dismissed at a museum dinner, and the quiet confidence he had mistaken for simplicity. Blythe glanced toward Callum with visible disbelief. "You did not know?" she asked softly. Zora opened the review file before he could answer. "Mercer Aerodyne is requesting $12 billion, she said. "Before this committee considers approval, we need to discuss the company's debt exposure, delayed certification schedule, and the revenue projections presented as secured contracts." Callum stared at her. The woman he had declared unfit for his world was seated at the head of the only table capable of deciding whether that world survived. Zora turned the first page. "Let us begin with the numbers you did not disclose." Callum looked down at the first page, but the numbers no longer appeared familiar. They had been organized into clean columns, each assumption separated from the story he usually wrapped around it. Zora had marked 3 contracts as unsigned, 2 supplier agreements as conditional, and a certification timeline as unsupported by the engineering record. Her questions came one at a time, calm and exact. Why was projected revenue from the Phoenix route included as secured income? Callum straightened in his chair. "The agreement is expected within the quarter." Expected is not secured. The negotiations are advanced. Zora turned to the chief financial officer seated beside him. Has the customer signed a binding commitment? The man hesitated. No, Blythe shifted in her seat. She had prepared a presentation built around growth, innovation, and confidence. Zora was asking for facts too plain to decorate. Callum tried to regain control. Every expansion plan contains assumptions. Not every assumption is presented to investors as certainty. Her voice remained even. That restraint made the room feel more severe than anger would have. She moved to the certification schedule. Engineering reports estimated that federal approval could take an additional 16 to 24 months. Mercer Aerodyne's proposal allowed only 6. Why was the independent estimate removed from the final presentation? She asked. Callum glanced toward one of his board members. We believe the internal team had better information. Your internal team wrote the independent estimate. Silence settled across the walnut table. Gideon did not intervene. He sat along the side with his hands folded, allowing Zora to lead exactly as promised. Callum looked at her again, searching for some private signal that the meeting could still become personal, that he could appeal to the years between them. She gave him none. Zora, he said, abandoning formality. We can discuss the details separately. She closed one section of the file. The details belong to the committee. Blythe lowered her eyes. The board members exchanged brief looks. Callum had spent years using private access to avoid public accountability. For the first time, Zora refused to let marriage follow him into the room as protection. She asked about executive compensation next. Bonuses had risen by 18%, while the research reserve had fallen below the minimum recommended by Mercer Aerodyne's own auditors. Callum defended the payments as necessary for retention. Zora requested the names of the employees whose compensation had increased. The list contained only senior executives. No engineers, technicians, or production managers appeared. You are asking Ellington Global to protect thousands of jobs, she said, while the people making the highest risk decisions protected themselves first. Callum's face tightened. That is an unfair characterization. Then correct it with the record. He could not. The review continued for nearly 2 hours. Zora questioned the engineers about propulsion testing, the financial team about debt exposure, and the board about oversight. She did not humiliate Callum. She did something more difficult for him to endure. She treated him like any other executive required to justify his decisions. By the end, Blythe had stopped taking notes. The board members no longer looked toward Callum before answering. Authority had shifted without anyone announcing it. Zora gathered the papers into a single stack. The technology deserves consideration, she said. The current governance does not. Callum leaned forward. Are you rejecting the investment? Zora looked at the employees listed in the manufacturing report, then at the debt schedule that could erase years of work if the financing failed. No, she said. Relief crossed his face too quickly. I am requiring conditions. She outlined them clearly. Independent financial oversight, full disclosure of delayed milestones, protection for research staff and retirement funds, limits on unilateral executive spending, and quarterly reporting directly to Ellington Global. The final condition made the room still again. Callum's authority over major financial decisions would be suspended until the company met the revised standards. You cannot expect me to accept that, he said. Zora met his eyes. Then Ellington Global will not invest. He stared at the woman he had once accused of not understanding his world. Now she was offering to save it, but only if he stopped pretending it belonged to him alone. Callum did not answer immediately. The room waited while the future he had presented as inevitable narrowed to a single decision he could no longer control. Accept Ellington Global's conditions, or watch Mercer Aerodyne lose the only financing large enough to carry the electric aircraft program through certification. He looked toward his board, expecting support. Instead, one director studied the revised oversight plan, while another quietly calculated the cost of refusal. The chief financial officer spoke first. The company cannot replace $12 billion on this timeline. Callum's gaze hardened. That does not mean we surrender executive control. Zora folded her hands over the closed file. Oversight is not surrender. It is the price of asking other people to carry risks you chose not to disclose. Blythe shifted beside him, her earlier confidence reduced to silence. She had built her position around Callum's image of certainty. Now every person in the room could see the distance between the image and the record. Gideon finally spoke from the side of the table. My daughter has recommended preserving the company, its employees, and its technology. Ellington Global could walk away without explanation. She chose not to. Callum looked at Zora. Because you want me to owe you. The accusation sounded smaller than he intended. Zora's expression did not change. No. I want the company to stop asking employees to absorb consequences that leadership avoids. One board member cleared his throat. I move that Mercer Aerodyne accept the conditional investment framework and begin immediate governance restructuring. Another member seconded the motion. Callum turned sharply. You cannot vote on this without further review. We have been reviewing it for months, the first director replied. Apparently, Ms. Ellington understood our position better than we did. The vote passed with only Callum opposed. His authority over major spending, debt, and expansion would be limited until the company met the new standards. An independent chief financial officer would be appointed. Executive bonuses would be suspended until research reserves recovered. Employee retirement contributions would remain protected, and no public announcement could use the Ellington name without written approval. Zora signed the preliminary authorization after the board signed its acceptance. The pen moved across the page with the same steady precision she had used on the divorce agreement. This time, Callum watched every letter of her name. Zora Ellington. When the others left, he remained seated. Blythe gathered her tablet slowly, waiting for him to rise. He did not. You knew all this time, he said. Zora placed the signed document inside the folder. I knew the company needed help. You knew who your father was. You knew what your family could do for me. For the company, she corrected. Not for you. Callum stood and walked toward the windows. Below them, the city appeared ordered and distant. Why did you never tell me? He asked. There was no anger left in the question, only the first trace of genuine confusion. Zora looked at the man who had once loved her before learning to love admiration more. I wanted to know whether you could value me without the name. He turned toward her. And you decided I could not. You decided that. Blythe lowered her eyes. The truth reached beyond the divorce, beyond the gala, beyond the woman waiting beside him. Callum had not lost access to the Ellington family because Zora kept a secret. He had lost it because, for years, he treated the person carrying that secret as though she had nothing worth knowing. Zora closed the folder and rose. The investment team will contact your board tomorrow. Callum took one step toward her. Zora, is there any way to undo this? She paused at the door. The company can recover. He understood. She was not speaking about the marriage. Zora left the room with Gideon beside her, not triumphant and not cruel. Behind them, Callum remained at the table where his future had been saved by the woman he had already chosen to lose. 1 year later, the first Mercer Aerodyne electric aircraft moved silently along the runway beneath a clear North Carolina sky. Engineers, investors, government officials, and hundreds of employees gathered behind the safety line as the aircraft completed its final demonstration and returned to the ground. Applause rose across the field, but Zora did not look toward the cameras. She watched the manufacturing team instead, the technicians who had worked through delayed testing, revised designs, and months of financial uncertainty. Their retirement accounts were protected. Research funding had been restored. The company had survived because the truth arrived before failure did. Zora stood near the viewing platform in an ivory suit, the Ellington crest visible at her shoulder. Her title now appeared beneath her name on the program. Chair of Ellington Strategic Ventures. The position was not ceremonial. She had built a new investment division focused on clean transportation, public infrastructure, and long-term employee protection. Gideon stood several feet away speaking with federal regulators, allowing his daughter to receive the recognition without placing himself at its center. Callum remained chief executive of Mercer Aerodyne, but the title no longer gave him unlimited authority. He reported to an independent board, answered to a new chief financial officer, and submitted every major expansion decision for review. The restrictions had angered him at first. Over time, they forced him to become the leader he had once claimed to be. He listened more. He promised less. He stopped treating caution as disloyalty. Whether the change came from wisdom or necessity no longer mattered to Zora. The company was healthier, and the people inside it were safer. Blythe left 6 weeks after the restructuring. Her public statement described a desire for new challenges, but everyone close to the company understood that the image she had helped Construct could not survive full transparency. Zora never spoke against her. She had learned that silence could protect dignity as easily as it once concealed pain. After the demonstration, Callum approached while reporters moved toward the aircraft. He looked older, not defeated, but stripped of the polish that had once hidden every doubt. "You were right about the timeline," he said. Zora looked toward the engineers celebrating near the hangar. "The engineers were right." He nodded. "I should have listened." The apology was not enough to restore what had ended, but it was honest, and Zora accepted it with a small incline of her head. "The company has another chance," she said. "Do not waste it." Callum hesitated, then asked the question he had carried for a year. "Why did you save it?" Zora turned toward him. "Because thousands of people should not lose their future because one man confused confidence with leadership." He absorbed the answer without defending himself. Her phone lit inside her hand as he walked away. A message from him appeared on the screen. "I understand now why you never told me." Zora read it once. Perhaps he finally did understand, or perhaps he only understood what the secret had cost him. Either way, she no longer needed his conclusion. A black sedan waited beyond the viewing platform, its door bearing the Ellington name in small silver letters. Gideon joined her near the steps. "Ready?" he asked. Zora looked back at the aircraft, the workers, and the company that had been saved without her returning to the marriage that nearly erased her. "Yes," she said. She entered the car and placed her phone face down beside her. The sedan moved away as the aircraft rose for one final pass above the runway. Callum had once told her she was not built for the world he was entering. In the end, she did not enter his world at all. She helped rebuild it, then continued toward one of her own.